Hi, Georgie. Thank you so much for coming back on the channel. I think a lot of people enjoyed the first interview. So if you guys have not yet, make sure you check out part one, where where Georgie reviews the criticisms on cholesterol and sugar. And the reason that we group those two together is because I feel like cholesterol and sugar are demonized in the same way, where, like Georgie brought up in the part one, it's like the fireman is caught at the fire, but is it actually the fireman who caused the fire? So
Right.
you guys tune into part one. And in part two, we're going to review even more criticisms because you guys brought up so many. And we're going to start back with sugar again, if that's okay. So, Georgie, what is your thought on the criticism that sugar is just empty calories? It's devoid of vitamins and minerals, and we don't need more empty calories as an obese nation.
Well, I mean, so is fat, right? If you're eating pure fat, it's also empty calories, unless you're eating it some kind of an animal fat that's got like remnants from whatever the animal was eating. I mean, if you're gorging up on pure coconut oil or pure olive oil, it's also empty calories. However, sugar gets metabolized differently and produces more carbon dioxide per unit than fat does. And maybe that's a discussion for a separate topic, but it's usually the levels of carbon dioxide that determine the level of mitochondrial biogenesis inside the organism. That's the cardinal regulator of mitochondrial biogenesis is basically are the levels of carbon dioxide, which is one reason when people go up in the mountain, they spend some time there, let's say like 2 weeks or even more, and then they go back down. When they test their tissues, both the number and the density of the mitochondria has increased dramatically, usually 4 or 5 times, which is one of the reasons why now elite athletes train at altitude for months before like a very important event, because when they go back to lower altitude, where usually the event is happening, for the next few weeks, they actually are dramatically outperforming their peers who have been training at altitude, all other things being equal. So if you want more mitochondria, then basically sugar is your friend. Fats are also not bad, but usually the ones that promote mitochondrial biogenesis are the short to medium chain fatty acids found in coconut oil. They actually get metabolized pretty similar to sugar. They don't require special transport like the longer chain fats, which depend on the amino acid L-carnitine to get shuttled into the mitochondria and processed. So in terms of empty calories, sure, I wouldn't overdo sugar unless you're also eating the cofactors that are needed to process it, right? Um, but as that study that I think I sent it over to you showed that if you're feeding rats like their normal chow, and then you allow them access ad libitum, which is freely, to additional liquid in the form of Coca-Cola. They were basically engulfing. I mean, they were gulping the equivalent of about 8 additional Cokes per day for an adult, and they actually were losing weight. So the whole argument, and as you know, Coke is empty calories, right? It's sugar, it's caffeine, caramel color, and a little bit of phosphoric acid, and that's about it. It doesn't have any vitamins, minerals, and whatnot like Red Bull say it does. But for whatever reason, those empty calories actually increase the metabolic rate of the animals, and the ones that were eating the regular chow plus the equivalent of 8 Cokes per day weighed less than the ones who were eating just the regular chow. So I mean, it's hard to explain this paradox unless you're willing to give sugar the credit that it's increasing the metabolic rate, even when it's not, entirely, even when your nutrient intake is not entirely scaled up to meet the extra, calories coming from sugar. Now, if you're only drinking Coke, you're probably going to run into some vitamin deficiencies, specifically vitamin B1 and B3, because those are cofactors required to metabolize the sugar. But the same thing is true if you're eating only pure fat. Like if you're only eating coconut oil and nothing else for a few days, you will run out of vitamin B2, riboflavin, because it's required for the beta oxidation process, and you will probably also run out of NAD, which is synthesized from niacin or niacinamide, which is vitamin B3. So if you're eating only empty calories, sure, you'll probably lead to some sort of depletion. But if you're eating a well balanced diet and adding extra calories on top in the form of pure sugar, I don't think you'll be causing a problem. In fact, you'll be increasing the metabolic rate. Several studies That study in rats was actually there's several citations inside of it discussing older human studies where adding up to a pound of sugar per day, pure sugar, nothing else. I guess they were just mixing it with drinks. Um, it actually led to improvement in glycemic control in people with type 1 diabetes. So these people don't even produce any insulin. So actually improved their glycemic control, allowed them to reduce the amount of insulin they were using, which is pretty striking. I mean, like for diabetes type 2, it also had beneficial effect. Actually, it reduced the level of fatty infiltration of their liver. Most people with type 2 diabetes have fatty liver disease as well. And then now that study showed that basically, like the study with the rats, confirmed that the same thing happens in animals. And recently, there was a human study demonstrating that adding a pound of sugar per day resulted in a drastic improvement of fertility in males. Now, why do I mention this? Because fertility in both males and females is actually one of the cardinal biomarkers of good health. It's considered an evolutionary luxury. Like if you're starving, fighting off a predator, or basically the environment is really not very beneficial, it's known that in both males and females, fertility drastically declines. In fact, very active female athletes have a now medical condition called the female athlete triad. One of the core signs of which, one of the diagnostic criteria of which, is infertility. They can't have children. And many former female athletes, when they end their athletic career, struggle for years. Some of them actually can't have children. They've damaged their ovaries and the whole energetic system supporting the ovaries to the point where they cannot have children. Um, so if adding a pound of extra pure white sugar without any cofactors drastically improve the fertility of males, it's very hard to argue that this is a bad, that sugar is somehow doing everything else wrong, but somehow selectively improving fertility. It just doesn't work that way. Fertility is a downstream effect of high metabolism, good health, and supportive environment.
So here is the study, the rat study that Georgie was talking about. And so you mentioned that there's some studies in here that they reference where they had some human studies that
Yep.
show the,
Yep. And I can send you, I also have a separate blog post on my blog where
okay,
I extracted those human studies and made a separate post about them as well. Just
okay.
so people don't need to go and dig around and try to find those studies themselves.
Okay, so I think it's, I think one of the biggest criticisms of the Ray Peat ideology is just like people think you should just be eating sugar, like all you should be eating is sugar. And I think context is always lost, and I think context is key. If you are someone who struggles to get in animal foods like liver, oyster, good ruminant muscle meat, and other organs and saturated fat from animals, like I think personally, I think that that should be your focus, developing good habits on these really nutrient dense foods. And I think that the discussion should kind of be centered along the lines of context matters. If you have an otherwise nutrient dense diet,
Right.
adding on sugars is not going to cause issues. And like you mentioned at the beginning, it could have positive effects on your metabolism, such as increasing carbon dioxide levels, which isn't talked about in many other spaces at all.
Right.
Where higher carbon dioxide levels have shown to improve metabolism, improve your mitochondria,
Right.
increase the number of mitochondria.
Right.
And that doesn't happen with fat metabolism.
That's
Unless,
right.
unless you're,
Definitely not with the polyunsaturated fats. The monounsaturated fats are neutral. Actually, the PUFAs decrease the number of mitochondria, mostly because they increase inflammation. They're precursors to the inflammatory cascade. Monounsaturated fats that are mostly found in olive oil, like oleic acid, they tend to be neutral. They're neither harmful nor beneficial. Then the saturated fats tend to increase mitochondria, and the ones that increase it the most are either the fatty acids with a chain length between 8 and 10, and then again also the fatty acids with a chain length higher than 16. There's like a family of very long chain fatty acid alcohols extracted from the hulls of wheat, from like sugarcane, etc. They're known as polycosanols. They're basically in the body, they're metabolized into fatty acids. They are themselves fatty acid alcohols, and their chain length is basically varies between 28 up to 40. And those, just a tiny amount of that in the milligram dosages per day range, have been shown to drastically reduce cholesterol, reduce cardiovascular risk, reduce already existing lesions along the arteries, remove cholesterol buildup in the wall, prevent the oxidation of cholesterol, which is, we already talked, the oxidized cholesterol is actually dangerous, but not cholesterol itself. And then basically improve the health of the vessel wall to the point where if they're being fed long enough, almost all signs of cardiovascular damage disappear. And it's basically, unfortunately, most of these studies were done in Cuba, and the Western world considers this fake commie science, and basically doesn't want to recognize it. But the mechanism is very sound, and it falls along the lines of saturated fats, improve metabolic rate, mostly by increasing the amount and density of the mitochondria and improving their function, and by also displacing the PUFA, which reduces inflammation and allows your body to use the energetic resources that normally would deal with inflammation, to focus on other things, and which allows it to better maintain its health.
Look at
Yeah.
Georgie defending fats. So
One other thing I wanted to mention,
yeah,
a lot of people are afraid of sugar because they say it's going to make me gain weight. It is a fairly often observed fact that people who have stressed themselves chronically and then they switch to like a higher sugar diet, they may initially put on weight. However, recent studies have discovered that this is not due to the sugar. It's due to the fact that chronically restricting sugar upregulates the enzyme that produces cortisol. And cortisol is known now as the primary driver of especially the mid-body obesity, the visceral fat. And there's now human studies with cortisol blockers showing that it can actually cure diabetes type 2 and lead to sustained weight loss without any caloric reduction, change in exercise habits, or change in the macronutrients. In fact, this study showed that basically just by blocking cortisol, you can continue to eat the same junk food that you always did, and you will actually lose the weight, which speaks very strongly to the fact that, to the hypothesis, supports the hypothesis that weight gain is an endocrine problem. It's not a lack of exercise, or it's not necessarily simply, packing on more calories. I mean, I know people who have been stressing themselves for years, and when they stop because their metabolic rate were so low due to the fasting and chronic over exercising, that they started gaining weight on a 1,000 calorie diet as soon as they stopped the low carbing. So it's not the carbs. I mean, you can't. So ideally, what should be happening is like, so if you're on a 1,000 calorie diet, right, and you're switching over, just changing the macronutrients, you shouldn't be gaining weight. But if you're starting to gain weight, it's not possible because you're eating the same amount of calories. Something else is going on, and that something is cortisol. It has now been confirmed with people with type 2 diabetes, just simple obesity, which usually precedes the type 2 diabetes. People with Cushing syndrome, they've always been known to have, every single one of them, to have insulin resistance and be prone to developing type 2 diabetes, et cetera, et cetera. So just a few simple human trials with a cortisol blocker demonstrated all of these can be wiped away, especially the weight loss problem, which is now 40% of Americans are obese. So you can actually get rid of it without without any change to their dietary habits. You can actually, I mean, I guess it's a wet dream of a pharmaceutical company, but I'm bringing it up to illustrate that if you have a weight problem, it is an endocrine problem. It's not that much a problem with like, oh, I'm eating too many calories, right? It's actually something else is going on. And when you're restricting sugar, you're creating the endocrine problem by upregulating the very mechanism that produces cortisol. You don't want to be messing with cortisol. You don't want it to be high. Every doctor, even mainstream doctor, will tell you high cortisol eventually will ruin your health. And that's exactly what happens if you chronically restrict carbs.
Okay, a lot to unpack there. Let's dive into some of those things. So, the first thing is this cortisol. I think that's one of the biggest points in the Ray Peat nutrition strategy is, hey, what can we do to reduce our cortisol levels? Because our environment is constantly bombarding us with stress, and we have this completely different environment than our ancestors did, and we have such higher levels of stress. However, one argument to that is, aren't there other ways to reduce our cortisol level than just adding in sugar?
Well, here's the thing. The reason the metabolic diet prefers the carbohydrates as fuel is that that's the one macronutrient that, when oxidized, is not known to produce any toxic byproducts, while also producing the highest amount of carbon dioxide per unit of raw material oxidized. So, for example, you can oxidize protein, but it's not good. In order for protein to be oxidized as fuel, first the amino acids have to be deaminated, which creates tremendous amounts of ammonia. Every doctor will tell you if you have a problem with ammonia, that's not good. It may ruin your kidneys. It will poison your brain. In fact, people that have a liver issue, they usually die. Like if it's a very advanced liver failure and they don't get a transplant, they die for something called hyperammonemic hepatoencephalopathy. In other words, too much ammonia that the liver could not handle is built up and is basically poisoning their brain. And because ammonia is toxic, it's good for plants, but definitely not for us. It is a byproduct of our metabolism. So if you're eating too much protein instead of carbs and fats, then some of that protein, actually most of it, will actually end up getting metabolized as fuel. It's not going to go. Some of it will go to building muscle, bone, what's et cetera, et cetera, renewing cells. But if you're eating too much protein without matching with carbs, you actually the body will say, okay, that's the fuel you're giving me, that's the fuel I'll use. And then it will try to oxidize these extra amino acids by first cleaving the ammonia group, the amino group, and creating ammonia, right? And then it will still oxidize these as sugar through the process of gluconeogenesis, which is a very wasteful process. It occurs in the liver, and in fact, it is a process that is upregulated in virtually every chronic disease, including diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and neurodegenerative diseases, to the point where now doctors are looking for drugs to block selectively the process of gluconeogenesis, hoping that that is a pathway which would cure some of these diseases. But I think it's too myopic. It's actually, they should be looking at why is gluconeogenesis increased. And the reason is because of elevated cortisol, which shreds the muscle, provides too many amino acids into the bloodstream, and the body has to dispose of them somehow. And the only way that the body knows of, other than peeing them out in your urine, which is what happens in diabetes, another test for diabetes, where you have protein in your blood, in your urine, then the other thing that the body can is only two things: either oxidize them as fuel or excrete them through the urine. And basically, but why, again, why is gluconeogenesis upregulated? Cortisol directly upregulates and also provides it with that fuel from by shredding your soft tissues and bones, pretty much everything. Cortisol is the master catabolic hormone, among other things, even though it's anti-inflammatory. So basically, if you have upregulated gluconeogenesis, chances are your cortisol is high, which is corroborated by those human studies with a cortisol blocker, which essentially cure their type 2 diabetes and drastically reduce gluconeogenesis. So you don't want to be oxidizing protein. It's a toxic as a fuel. You're going to ruin yourself. You can actually, even if you don't get diabetes, if you eat more than, I think the average amount that was found to be harmful was about 3 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, which means if you're weighing, let's say, 200 pounds, that's about 300 grams of protein a day. You can actually go into kidney failure, acute kidney failure, and most people recover from that. But if that continues, if that is your normal diet, you can actually fry your kidneys, and there's no coming back from that. So you don't want to be oxidizing protein. The role of protein is for building tissue, and some amino acids serving as raw material for neurotransmitters, such as the amino acid phenylalanine. It's a precursor to dopamine, and then glycine, proline, hydroxyproline, all of these are part of collagen. So you're building skin, bone, hair, right? Connective tissue. This leaves two macronutrients that are available for oxidation: fat or glucose. Now, again, first, produce more carbon dioxide from glucose. And second, when you're eating fat, unless that fat is fully saturated, some of the fat that you, if it, the fat is some of the fat is polyunsaturated, by the process of oxidizing it, because it's so easily peroxidized, you're going to create toxic lipid peroxidation byproducts, which even at this point, even every mainstream doctor will tell you it's not a good thing. We've seen their levels elevated in every chronic disease out there. You name it, if it's a chronic disease, lipid peroxidation is involved. So then if you want to be oxidizing fat, the only safe way to do it really is to eat fully saturated fat, such as hydrogenated coconut oil. Even regular coconut oil will do, but it still contains about 2% of PUFA. And then basically that's it. So, but that's not very sustainable. It means if people end up on the high fat, low carb diet, they will end up ingesting a sufficient amount of polyunsaturated fats to cause themselves problems. So that really leaves only sugar as the only metabolic fuel that is not known through the process of metabolism to produce any toxic residues. I mean, their claims that sugar is dangerous through different mechanisms. We address some of those, such as advanced glycation bioproducts, right? Or that sugar raises inflammation. Again, I don't know of any proposed mechanism through which sugar does that. Most of the things that are being blamed on sugar have subsequently be found out to be due to polyunsaturated fats. So really, I mean, there's a number of different reasons why sugar is the preferred fuel. And then, but if it makes you gain weight, there is another issue there, probably related to high cortisol. And finally, even if you gain weight, that does not necessarily mean you're becoming unhealthier. Recent study demonstrated that, confirm actually for the, I don't know, at least 100th time, the so-called obesity paradox, that people who are obese and even morbidly obese have drastically lower death rate from serious diseases. Now, if you get into a gunfight and you're obese and you get shot, you go to the hospital, you have a higher chance than a lean, muscular person surviving in the intensive care unit, even if you get riddled with bullets. If you have cancer and you go to the hospital and you have to endure some kind of a surgery, like if they didn't know about a cancer and it was suddenly discovered or it ruptured and it's an emergency surgery, you have a 3 to 4 times higher chance of surviving the surgery if you're morbidly obese, not simply overweight, morbidly obese. And then the list goes on and on and on. Oh, infectious disease. If you're morbidly obese and in the hospital, you actually have a higher chance of surviving COVID. Now, you have a higher risk of getting COVID, but you have a higher chance of surviving it if you ever end up in the ICU. And finally, a recent study demonstrated that 40% of obese and morbidly obese people are actually metabolically healthy. Their cholesterol is fine, their blood pressure is fine, their inflammatory biomarkers such as C-reactive protein and erythrocyte sedimentation rate, both of these were fine. Both of these are known biomarkers for impending cardiovascular disease or diabetes. And most of them, like all of these 40% of these obese or morbidly obese people, basically half, actually did not need any of the pharmacological interventions that doctors are flocking to give them because, oh my God, look at how heavy you are. You must be unhealthy. We'll immediately have to treat you. No, it's usually an adaptive response. And the question is, what could this adaptive response be? And why? Well, the one thing that is known for certain is that heavier people, on average, per kilogram of body weight, have higher metabolic rate. So that, to me, explains it all. I mean, basically, if the body cannot maintain its tissues, of course, lean muscle mass is preferable. Ideally, you should look like Hulk, and most of it, if you're male, and most of it should be muscle. But if you cannot afford to be Hulk, it's better to look like, I don't know, what's a morbidly obese cartoon character, and what's a very skinny cartoon character that we can compare it to.
Like Bill Gates style.
Yeah. So basically, if you cannot be Hulk, it's better to look like a balloon, to be like Pete from like Mickey Mouse.
Wrestler.
Say it again. Yes. Exactly. If you cannot be Hulk, it's better to be, metabolically speaking, health-wise, it's better to be a sumo wrestler than look like a stick. It's usually not a sign of very good health.
Like soy boy,
exactly.
Bill Gates.
Soy boy, exactly. Soy boy Bill Gates. Yeah. So that's where the science leads, and that's why now they actually have a Wikipedia page for the obesity paradox. And if you go there, you'll see how like the different factions are battling. Like it's getting edited every day. Like people add more studies saying like, oh look, obesity is really not the monster we thought it is. Then immediately somebody else adds another study saying, oh, it's probably just a statistical fluke. And that actually went on for about 3 to 4 years because I've been monitoring since like 2010. And eventually the detractors stop editing the page and admitted that this thing is real, right? But actually I take offense with the wording obesity paradox. There's no paradox there. It's just simply because people don't know what obesity is and why is it there? Why does it happen to so many people? Well, it's a very simple explanation. When you're under stress, cortisol gets upregulated and it's a sign for the body to store the excess calories, basically as adipose tissue, first as a source of emergency fuel, and second because it maintains your metabolic rate. Because stress lowers your metabolic rate by suppressing hormone production. Body says, okay, I cannot afford to basically have my healthy thyroid functioning and everything is great. Then what I'm going to do is maintain like a slightly lower but still higher metabolic rate than a skinny person, the soy boy, by packing on the pounds in the form of fat. It's apparently evolutionary. It is less dangerous, and now the obesity paradox confirms, than being truly skinny. I mean, it sounds pretty obvious, right? I mean, if you're too skinny and you're out in the wilderness with no food, you get injured. Where's the body going to get the resources from to repair you? You need those basically if your health is suboptimal or you're under chronic stress, which usually tend to be about the same thing, then you need those extra pounds. It's not, your body is not trying to kill you. Nature is not trying to kill you. It's simply a suboptimal, slightly suboptimal adaptive response to the stresses that are around you. And the sumo wrestlers who tend to eat a lot of saturated fat, if you look at the fatty acid composition of their fatty tissue, it's actually mostly saturated. And sumo wrestlers, if you ask a cardiologist, cardiologist will say these people should be dropping like flies from heart attack. They do not. They actually have a lower rate of heart attacks, unless like then once you get into like a 600 pounds, that's a different story. But then it becomes a different issue. It's actually the extra weight over the years starts to physically damage their joints and connective tissue, so it becomes an inflammatory reaction, which eventually causes heart disease. But while these people are active and still wrestling, I mean, they're pretty nimble for carrying around 300 to 400 pounds. Hard to argue that these people are not healthy, and their biomarkers of inflammation, of cholesterol, etc., etc., they're pretty normal. They only look abnormal, but metabolically, chances are they're healthier than most of the leanies running around and drinking soy.
Okay, okay, all right. Okay, so who wants to be obese though? I think we should always return to like what the optimal condition would be, which is I do think that people should be working out and should have muscle mass on them. I think
Right?
that sarcopenia is
Exactly.
a big issue. And I think it's always important to remember that muscle is the most metabolically active tissue. And so the more muscle mass you have, the higher your metabolism is going to be.
Exactly. So we should be aiming at body recomposition, changing the body's composition, not simply losing weight, which that distinction seems to be lost on the vast majority of both nutritionists and doctors. To doctors, losing pounds is great, no matter how it is achieved. There's a great quote from, I think it was an endocrinologist from Harvard, who used to say, so look, if you look like a pear when you were obese and then you lose weight through dieting and exercise, you're not going to be skinny. You'll just be a smaller pear. So what really needs to happen is for you to actually change the body composition. All he's saying is that you're going to still maintain the same unhealthy distribution of fat, which is around the midsection. There will be just less of it, right? But as soon as your dieting or exhaustive exercise regimen stops, you will pack the pounds right back on. In fact, the show The Biggest Loser demonstrated that every single one of them that lost their weight through grueling exercise and dieting, and actually they turned out to behind the scenes were even giving them beta agonists, like basically the drugs used for allergy because they're known to increase fatty acid oxidation. They're used as doping in sports, right? And then every single one of these people, after they stopped the competition, not only did we gain their weight, they actually ended up at a higher point than they were before. Why? Because they lowered the metabolic rate while they were doing the grueling exercise and dieting, and now basically with the lower metabolic rate, even with less calories, they ended up weighing more. There was I can send you the link. There was an interview with several of them who said that was the biggest mistake of their life. They said Biggest Loser was me joining that stupid show and destroying my health, because now basically some of them are forced to have gastric bypass surgery or go on actually regimens with some drugs to kind of keep the weight in check, because before they were obese but they were stable. They weren't continuously gaining weight. Now they weren't healthy, they weren't happy, right? Actually, we don't know if they weren't healthy. Doctor saw they're obese, said automatically said you're unhealthy. Well, at least 40% of these people are perfectly healthy, or at least indistinguishably healthy compared to the average soy boy skinny on the street.
Yeah.
So again, you're absolutely right. Ideally, men should be looking like Hulk, and a lady should be, again, still should have good muscle mass and more subcutaneous than central fat, right? That's what gives you the youthful look, like the gaunt, really scary look of very old or very sick people, especially with cancer, is due to the rapid metabolism of the subcutaneous fat. So you start looking like a skeleton with just a bit of skin on top of it, right? But even those people, the very sick ones, they're actually losing their visceral fat the last, which shows that it's actually the visceral fat is staying there, and that's the sign of sickness. But if you have good subcutaneous fat, and if you're basically have decent muscle mass as a woman, do not make the mistake of forcing yourself to lose weight simply to lose weight. You need to be doing things that change the body composition. If you have extra middle body fat in the midsection, then you got to be doing more weights, trying to raise your metabolic rate, things like that, but not through stress. That's what really exercise does. It raises your metabolic rate temporarily through the stress system, through adrenaline and cortisol. You're pushing yourself, and people are telling you it's good for you. It's not. Every doctor will tell you that if you inject somebody with enough adrenaline, they'll go into cardiac arrest. Do you know how many people are actually collapsing and dying in gyms around the world because they overexert themselves, to the point that now most gyms have a disclaimer saying if you have a BMI over 30, I think 5 or something, if you have a history of heart disease, high cholesterol, etc., sign a disclaimer that if you sign up with us and we start put you through this grueling exercise regimen, which is usually not geared towards weightlifting. They start making them like jump ropes and do all these things that are it's basically cardio exercise. They're asking you to sign a disclaimer that if you drop dead from heart attack, your relatives are not going to sue. So there's a reason for that. And which means is do not stress yourself if you're unhealthy. Evaluate the situation sanely, wisely, and you do the things that you feel like they're making you feel better. Your internal guidance instinct of making you feel better is very, very reliable. Recent studies showed that feeling unwell was the best predictor of impending chronic or acute, very, very severe disease than what the biomarkers were saying. So they had these two groups of people go to the doctor. Doctor said, "Oh, let me do these tests, right? Oh, you look healthy. Go home." But then a subgroup of these people said, "I really don't feel healthy." And then the doctor kept saying, "Look, it's all in your head. If you keep coming here, I'm going to send you to a psychiatrist." And then later, overwhelmingly, almost all of these people who said they continue feeling unwell turn out that they have some kind of a chronic condition that was still undiagnosed, usually like impending diabetes, sometimes cancer, right? But it's the feeling of unwellness that very often not very often, it always has a physiological basis. And if you feel like the trainer is killing you, literally killing you with these regimens, which is regimens of like, I don't know, running around like a beast, like a racehorse, and you're weighing 200 pounds, that's not good for you. In any book, even the doctor will probably say, "I don't like how this person is getting red in the face. It's a sign of elevated histamine, serotonin. That person is at risk of heart attack. Cool it off."
I think the biggest thing people need to keep in mind is to meet yourself where you're at.
Mhm.
So everyone is at a different place. First and foremost, if you have weight that you want to lose, if it's a lot around the midsection, that is just screaming that you have an endocrine problem.
Exactly.
You
Exactly.
need to fix that first, fix your metabolism first, or else your weight loss is not going to be sustainable and it's not going to be healthy. So fix your metabolism. There may be healing pounds that result in that healing, fixing your metabolism phase. However, think of it in the long term and need to find a more sustainable approach to body recomposition, or like slight weight loss I don't think is a problem as long as it's done in a good way.
Right.
And then the same thing applies to exercise. If you haven't exercised in years, we should not be going from 0 to 100. You need to add that in very slowly. I
Absolutely.
personally, this is one area where I slightly disagree with some people in the Ray Peat community, because I think that exercise should be something that everyone is doing. However, meet yourself where you're at. Don't try to exercise like someone else. You need to find out a routine that makes you feel good, allows you to move closer to your goals, allows you to put on muscle mass without overstressing yourself.
Exactly.
So I don't know. I think that a little bit of stress and a little bit of cortisol can do the body a little bit of good. Obviously, overdoing it is never a good thing, but you should never compare yourself in what you can handle to anyone else, because we are all different and you need to meet yourself where you're at. So that's kind of
Exactly.
the approach that I like to tell people is context gets lost and you need to understand your context before going down a weight loss journey.
And the question should always be, if I started as a pear, am I simply becoming a smaller pear, or am I starting to look like the V-shaped monster that I want to be if you're a male, or like the amphoric shape of a woman that, presumably if that's what women want. If that's not happening as a result of the exercise and dieting and whatever your doctor, trainer, a consultant, advocate is doing, then this is probably not in your favor. I mean, I think I sent you that study on the intermittent fasting. The lead doctor, the dietologist, and he's an MD at the University of California, San Francisco, who led the biggest study so far on intermittent fasting. This line will always stick with me. He's like, I was an intermittent fasting practitioner myself. After seeing the results, I'm no longer doing that. I'm no longer recommending to my patients/clients, And finally, he's like, remember, just because you're losing weight does not mean you're becoming healthier, right? And again, merging this with the pear and the V-shaped thing and the amphoric shape, you have to look at body recomposition. Visceral fat is bad. Subcutaneous fat, peripheral fat is not really a bad thing. So if you're feeling better, and again, if you have visceral fat, this means cortisol is high. If you're getting into a very intense exercise regimen or dieting, cortisol will go even higher. If you actually go to the doctor and ask, and now it's becoming actually is becoming more and more accepted to do an endocrine profile before the doctor recommends that somebody embarks on a diet or a specific type of exercise, just to see where things stand, because doctors are realizing that there is another issue that's causing this packing of the pounds, especially if it's in a very short period of time, right? So if you're lean and suddenly you change diet or you change jobs, right, or there was another major change in your life, like you got married or you got divorced or you have kids or something else happened, right, and suddenly you pack on 40 pounds, like let's say 20-30% of your previous weight, that's usually not a sign that you're eating too much. It's a sign that something has happened to your metabolic rate, and the issue is usually endocrinological in origin.
So I do think that it, again, context. Sometimes I think people spread the message that like just add sugar and your cortisol will go down. I think that
No,
there's
that's
so
not true.
many things. You
Right.
have to like consider all lifestyle factors. Proper breathing. You should be breathing through your nose, not through your mouth. Taking time for rest and recovery. And so it's not just dietary. There's so many lifestyle changes that one needs to reflect on to reduce their cortisol.
Right.
And like we were talking about, like focusing on fixing your metabolic rate and reducing your cortisol is going to set you up for success for converting your pair into like inverting your pair, right?
Exactly. Inverted you pair if you're a male. I mean, because
Yeah.
some females
And
don't
for a
want to look like a
female,
V
for a
shape.
female getting better fat distribution despite just
Right.
having the center of your body. So reducing cortisol and improving your metabolic rate is going to help you reach your goals faster and more sustainably rather than just like cutting calories a bunch right from the start and increasing cardio and increasing your cortisol. Because you see this all the time. People's metabolisms adjust to like 1200 calories. A baby, a child needs more than 1200 calories.
Right.
It is not normal for females to be consuming 1200 calories. You are causing harm in your body, and that is not sustainable or healthy long term. So, again, focus on fixing your metabolism and your cortisol first, and then reevaluate your weight issue.
Exactly. And keep in mind, is the body composition changing? If it is not, and you're simply losing the pounds, 9 out of 10, it's actually not a good change, and you need to be reevaluating where you're going. So yeah, just packing on the sugar. So a lot of people say take this message and say, okay, let me add more sugar and things will go away. Well, if you're already insulin resistant, when you add more sugar, then this will trigger an insulin response, right? But the insulin response will also trigger a cortisol response. So by adding more sugar, you'll be and only doing that, you may be making things worse if the person is already obese. Now, if the person is lean, and they haven't stressed themselves chronically, their cortisol is not chronically upregulated, the production of it, then I don't think switching from a low carb to a high carb diet will actually be very detrimental, or they will see much of a weight gain. It's usually the people who have issues with weight, right? They try to low carb diet to actually improve their weight, right? But in the process, they're actually increasing their insulin resistance because burning fat decreases both the receptor density for insulin, which is required in order for insulin to have its blood sugar lowering effects. So the body perceives this as insufficient insulin and starts producing more. So it's not abnormal to see that when people stop their, it's not rare to see that when people stop their low carb diet, they're actually, their insulin levels are already high despite them not consuming almost any carbs. Why? Because the body senses through the, because of the excessive oxidation of fat, they've driven themselves into insulin resistance by decreasing the sensitivity of the insulin receptors. So the body is already producing a lot of insulin, which is one of the signs of insulin resistance. And when they stop, right, and especially if they're already overweight and start packing on the sugar, then what happens is that due to the insulin resistance, the sugar cannot get metabolized. Body says, oh my God, I need more insulin to lower blood sugar. Let me jack up the insulin again. But insulin and cortisol always go hand in hand because the brain cannot survive without sugar. People with type 1 diabetes can go into hypoglycemic coma. So the brain really needs the sugar. So if insulin rises, there is a counterbalance mechanism of cortisol as well, because cortisol, its secondary role, aside from being an inflammatory hormone, anti-inflammatory, it's to maintain blood sugar, prevent it from dropping to zero. If it drops to zero, you're dead immediately. And basically, what happens is if you're insulin resistant already and you add more sugar and insulin goes even more, cortisol will continue rising. And then most of that sugar will end up being stored as fat because cortisol promotes the synthesis of fat from everything, especially from carbohydrates. There's an enzyme called fatty acid synthase, which cortisol is the most potent promoter of.
So I think that that's a really important point that we should cover just briefly. So, what does someone do who's insulin resistant and is interested in switching from a low carb to more of a pro-metabolic or carbohydrate fueled?
Okay, so a couple of things. It is an endocrinological problem, typically associated with cortisol and estrogen in both men and women. But the direct insulin resistance is driven by elevated levels of free fatty acids in the blood. And because the cell can only metabolize either carbohydrates or fats at any single point in time due to the infamous Randle cycle, if you're oversupplying fatty acids, basically obese people, some obese people tend to have elevated so-called lipolysis and stress resist lipolysis, right? So as long as you're flooding your bloodstream with fat, whether through diet or by being stressed, which causes cortisol and adrenaline to shred your fatty tissue as well, this prevents the cells from metabolizing glucose, which means that if you take something or do something that lowers the supply of fat to the bloodstream, whether through diet or through the fatty tissue, right? Then this should improve the metabolism of glucose because there's nothing damaged inside the cell. Many people have looked for very carefully, I mean, for decades, and thought that insulin resistance and diabetes are actually some kind of a defect in the cell, just like cancer is. Turn out there's no such thing. Basically, the cell can only do what environment allows it to do and what has been set up to do naturally. So, which means I can only oxidize either carbs or fats. If you're giving me fats all the time, I cannot metabolize those carbs, which means they're going to float around and they're going to wait. They will get wasted, most of them, because they will enter the cell, but it can only go through the step of glycolysis and not through the mitochondrial oxidative metabolism, which means the cell will waste the glucose into lactic acid, which is toxic, is now known to actually be involved in the generation of cancer, not simply a sign of cancer, but now actually lactic acid is known to even promote the appearance of cancer. And then whatever doesn't get wasted as lactic acid will get converted to fat through the enzyme fatty acid synthase. So you have to lower the supply of fat to the cells. One way of doing it is by lowering the intake of fat relative to carbohydrates in your diet, right? So if you're eating 2,000 calorie diet, just as an example, and let's say you're eating 50% fat, right? I don't know, 40% carbs and 10% protein, then basically you can maintain this 2,000 calorie diet a day by lowering the fat to, let's say, 30%. And then and this will allow you to eat actually a lot more carbs because fats are more than 2 times more energetic per unit. They have 9 calories per gram than carbs are. So if you're only lowering, if it looks like a small decrease from 50% to 30% of fat, but that 20% in calories basically translates to a much bigger increase in grams of carbohydrates, right? So that should not lead to actually to gaining fat because you're lowering the amount of fat that you're consuming through the diet. If you're already obese, then you should be evaluating your endocrine situation because in order to become obese, chances are you either had an endocrine problem, you're eating too much fat, or both, combination of both. Now, there are many obese people, and I suspect those 40% that were found to be metabolically healthy, there are many obese people who actually have perfectly fine insulin sensitivity. They do not, obesity, insulin resistance do not always go hand in hand, much to the surprise and the chagrin of the diabetic drug industry, right? And the question is, okay, so what separates an obese person whose insulin sensitivity is perfectly fine from an obese person who is on his or her way of becoming diabetic? Turns out it's the basically rate of lipolysis, all other things being equal. So the people who are on their way to become diabetics, the overweight people, are people who are under stress. Their cortisol is elevated, the adrenaline is elevated, the free fatty acids in the blood are high. So they're becoming and staying insulin resistant. And until those fatty acids are lowered somehow, lowering stress is one way, right? But as you said, we're all under stress. What can we do? So it's kind of like a catch-22. If a person is already obese, right, and they're basically they're insulin resistant, what do they do? You kind of have to hit it at multiple angles. You have to decrease the supply of dietary fat, not too much though. I mean, we already talked about that certain amount of fat is vital for, especially for female health, especially female reproductive health. And so you have to reevaluate the composition of your diet, right? That's one thing. Second thing is you have to do something to lower the free fatty acids in the blood directly. And couple of things that are over the counter and widely available are things like aspirin, niacinamide, vitamin E, progesterone. All of these have anti-lipolytic effects. So they're going to lower the lipolysis rate, the excessive lipolysis. So you'll have less free fatty acids in the blood, which will allow the body to metabolize the glucose, right? And then finally, you need to check the endocrine balance, because if for whatever reason your cortisol and estrogen are high, and there could be measures for that menopausal women, the estrogen is actually high if you check the right kinds of estrogen. Doctors only check estradiol, which is low because it's produced by the ovaries. They fail after menopause. So doctors say, oh, your estrogen is low, you need more. No, but at least 3 different kinds of estrogen. And if you check their estrone or estrone sulfate, it's actually very, very high. And it can get converted to estradiol. So you have to do the endocrine check. And if it turns out that one or more of these stress hormones is out of whack, and you try to lower stress, or you take some anti-stress chemicals and these things don't decrease, then you have to do something to pharmacologically oppose them. Ray's favorite thing is progesterone because it blocks both cortisol and estrogen, right? Other things like pregnenolone and potentially DHEA may help as well. So it really depends on how severe the endocrine imbalance is. Some clinics have discovered now that aging males, especially the ones that are obese, can be cured of virtually all of their ills by high-dose testosterone injections weekly under the care of a doctor. So it's been long known that the so-called aging male phenotype, which is basically taking the V shape and putting it in the middle, becoming a regular pear-shaped person, right? It's actually it's always been known as being associated with declining androgens in males. So, but not many people thought that, okay, well, what if we replace the androgens in males? Would that have a beneficial effect? Turns out it does. Why? Well, because testosterone, among other androgens, blocks the effects of cortisol and blocks the effects of estrogen. Even though testosterone can aromatize into estrogen, when you basically given it in the proper dosages, its effects are mostly anti-stress. So you're blocking cortisol, you're blocking estrogen, it lowers adrenaline, right? So this means you're immediately improving insulin sensitivity on all fronts, right? I mean, okay, so you have to also worry about the diet, but those clinics demonstrated that old obese males can actually have their vitality restored. Even 93-year-old males can have vitality restored by giving them an androgen, right? They didn't change anything in their diet. They kept eating the same crap as they did before that made them fat in combination with the stress. Simply giving them something that restored the endocrine balance was sufficient. Do I think this is the right way to go always? No. We should be worrying about diet, right? Not worrying. That's a bad word. We're already worrying about too many things. We should be careful about our diet, and we should be reevaluating always what is it that we're doing with our lives. As Steve Jobs, may he rest in peace, he gave a great graduation address at Stanford in 2005. He said, if you know you're going to die tomorrow, how many of the things you're currently doing would look pointless and useless and even harmful to you? And he's saying, if everything, try to put yourself in that mindset, and everything that actually that you determine would be pointless, useless, or even harmful, he's like, you better stop doing that right now, because when the time comes, right, and for many of us it's not a choice, sometimes it's sudden, you don't want to be lying in a hospital bed and basically filled with regret and saying, I wasted my life. He said, that's how I felt. He was giving that speech about a year after he was first diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and he was telling people he was cured, but apparently he wasn't. Cancer returned. So it's still a great speech. And eventually, when he was on his deathbed, he basically said to his, I think it was to his wife or his mentor, he said, remember my speech at Stanford? He said, 100 times over. He said, tell people that whatever that you're doing right now, if it's not feeling meaningful, it's not worth doing. No matter how much you get paid for it, no matter what kind of like ego boost you're getting from it, if it does not feel meaningful, and that is a different thing to different people, he said, it's not worth doing. Even for me, who
Yeah.
I think at the time he was the richest person in the world.
Okay. So I agree. You talked about like some pharmaceutical options, and I think that that's definitely extreme. For other people who are insulin resistant, I think focus on your diet. And obviously, if you're consuming right now like 70 to 80% fat, adding carbs on top of that is not a good idea.
Exactly.
Reduce your so if this is your fat intake and this is your carb intake, you should still be consuming protein. Reduce your fat intake and increase your carbs, but don't go to zero fat.
Exactly.
I don't want to
Yeah,
say
exactly. Yeah.
It just make that switch gradually, because if you haven't been using carbs for a while, your body is not necessarily prepped and primed for it. So slowly increase the amount of carbs that you're consuming, slowly reduce the amount of fats, and find a medium where you feel good. You're moving closer to your goals. You don't have hormone and fertility issues. No one is saying go low fat. No one is
Right.
saying here.
Yep.
But adding on carbs on top of a high fat diet is going to lead to late weight gain. Like there's
Absolutely.
no getting around
Yeah.
that. I
And do some blood tests like for free fatty acids, for like blood glucose, things like that. If these are staying, if your blood glucose is staying high, usually means your free fatty acids are also high. It means something is happening to cause these to be high. Stress or endocrine balance, and they actually form a vicious circle, right? So you need to be, that means you need to be addressing those issues as well, because that means just changing your diet alone is sometimes is insufficient. And
yeah.
if your doctor is trying to put you on metformin, which is a very popular diabetes drug, then you're already taking pharmacological interventions. There are safer methods. So you may be asking, you may want to ask your doctor to check your cortisol, check your estrogen. Usually, if one or both of these come back high, the doctor will actually reevaluate the metformin therapy. He or she will refer you to an endocrinologist, and there are other options available, most of which actually end up working about the exact same way as progesterone and testosterone. So if it comes down to pharmacological interventions, then I think you have a green light to try over the counter things like progesterone, pregnenolone, DHEA, things like that, because you're already being pushed towards taking drugs because the situation is endocrinologically severe.
So, and then my point is, I think even before that, uh, healthy levels of exercise have been shown to reduce the amount of energy in your blood because your body is expending more.
Yep.
And so find a sustainable way to move your body. I think that that is an effective way to get rid of, like, if you have a desk job and you're sitting down all day and you're not moving, find a way that's not extremely stressful to get started on a workout routine. Again, meet yourself where you're at, your context, and find a sustainable way to move your body such that you're not increasing your cortisol. But I think that anyone that is not doing any sort of exercise and can implement something, they're going to see an improvement in their insulin sensitivity.
Absolutely. Just even with a light weight, if you're doing bicep curls,
Yeah.
like 10 of them each day, very quickly within a few weeks you would have built up enough strength to actually doing more, like heavier weights, and it really has a dramatic effect on changing the body composition.
Yeah.
Again, if the pair is not changing into an inverted pair, then whatever you're doing needs to be reevaluated.
Yes. I think a lot of people are looking for a solution without implementing exercise. And I think that that's just a really missing piece. Not stressful, not extremely stressful exercise, but I
Right.
think healthy levels of exercise are a really important piece to this.
Some
Um,
people say like I mean there's a myth that Ray's against like things like running and swimming and whatnot, but he's not. It's just you have to keep it so-called lactate bound. In other words, if you're running with a partner, preferably run with somebody else or run out in nature, because it's been shown that when you're doing something that's stimulating for the brain as well as for the body, you're burning a lot more calories. The brain consumes 40% of the daily caloric intake. So it's a very energetically demanding organ. So the more brain stimulating activity you do, the more calories you're going to burn and the more beneficial it will be for you. So if you're running with a partner, then the criteria for whether you're basically like overexerting yourself is, can you hold a conversation with that partner while running? If you're starting to gasp for breath, like for air, means you're already reaching the lactate threshold. Carbon dioxide is drastically decreasing, and then you're gasping for breath. Really, that's what's causing the gasping. Carbon dioxide and lactic acid are inversely correlated. So if you're low on carbon dioxide, you will not be getting properly oxygenated. So your body will give you these signals that you feel like you're suffocating. So you're going to be like, right? And then you're going to be, your speech, the sentences will be interrupted, even the words. If you're at that level, it means you're overexerting yourself. You got to cool off a little bit, but you can certainly run. And I think the one consistent thing in terms of aerobic exercise that Ray has always said it's probably safest for everybody is walking. So, I mean, it takes a little bit longer, but keep in mind, you're burning the exact same amount of calories per unit of distance covered. It's some people think, no, if I'm running, I'm actually burning more calories. It's not. It's actually the amount of force to move a certain amount of weight a certain distance. That's what determines how much energy you're expending. That's really the physical formula. I know it's a little bit counterintuitive, but if you're walking 5 miles or you're running the 5 miles, you'll burn the about the same amount of calories, but the walking will be a lot less stressful and probably a lot more beneficial, because when you're walking, you have more energy to like pay attention to your surroundings, talk to the people that are around you, like evaluate nature, things like that. And that's more stimulating than simply like this like breathless running for 5 miles, because you're really short on time and you want to exactly you want to make the most out of your time. Well, guess what? You're not, because if you cannot dedicate a non-stressful amount of time to do the proper exercise, then it's actually probably better not to run. I mean, just delay it until you can walk, or do it in a fashion that is maybe a bit more time consuming, but it's going to pay off multiple times over by improving health instead of destroying it.
I think for someone who's insulin sensitive or insulin resistant and wants to try to reverse that, develop a strong walking routine
Mhm.
and start a low stress workout routine where you can build muscle, because again, muscle is very metabolically active tissue and that's
Yep.
just gonna help you. Don't focus on cardio, like really stressful cardio. Focus on those two things. And I think that that's going to lead to a more sustainable long-term approach.
Yeah, and a great gauge is when you're healthier, when you're becoming healthier and leaner, you'll feel so much more energy. You will want to run. Now, if you're in a state where you have to push yourself to run, that's probably not a good thing to do. So it's always listen to your internal thing. I mean, I know doctors emphasize listening to them instead of to yourself. That needs to change. Even studies are now showing that what you know about yourself, medicine can never come even close to touching.
Yeah. All right. So I think we should move on to the like fasting and autophagy.
Mhm.
I think that that is one of the biggest criticisms of the Ray Peat nutrition strategy, where one of the principles is that you should eat every 3 to 4 hours to keep your blood sugar stable.
Right.
And on the flip side, the carnivore, keto, and fasting community says fasting leads to autophagy, gives your digestive system a break, um, and you can keep more stable blood sugar this way. And there's therapeutic benefits to fasting. Not gonna lie, like Sarah and I implemented fasting a few years ago, and we definitely saw our inflammation go down. So I'm curious on your response to these bigger claims about fasting.
They're right about giving your digestive system a break. And actually, that explains virtually all of the benefits of fasting. In fact, there are studies that demonstrated that if you give a non fasting animal a blocker of the receptor for endotoxin, they're experiencing the exact same benefits as the animals that are fasted. In fact, giving animals antibiotics that basically sterilize their guts, or TLR4 receptor, which is the endotoxin receptor blockers, actually led to sustained weight loss without reduction in calories, and changes in various biomarkers related to inflammation, cardiovascular disease, potential for developing cancer and things like that. All of these basically were indistinguishable from the animals that were subjected to intermittent fasting. The animals that fasted chronically experienced almost the same benefits as the intermittently fasted animals and the ones with the cortisol blocker and the antibiotics, but it only continued for the first few weeks. After that, the chronic fasting animals actually became drastically unhealthier because it mimics a low carb diet. And then, if you're really chronically under fasting, you're lowering your metabolic rate and you're losing muscle mass really much faster than fat. So you're going to end up really destroying your health, because, like you said, muscle is the most metabolically active tissue in the body. Muscles at rest prefer to burn mostly fat. So by losing the muscle through fasting, you're setting yourself up for lowering the metabolic rate and basically decreasing your ability to metabolize even the fats that you're going to start ingesting if you're doing the low carb diet. So yes, they're right about the giving your digestive system a break, but it has been shown that you can achieve the same by not feeding the bacteria in your intestinal system, by not providing food. What does that mean by food? Well, eat foods that are easily digestible and they get processed mostly in the stomach or the upper third of the small intestine. And if you eat foods like that, then basically the bacteria, by the time like this processed food reaches the colon, there wouldn't be much left to process. And the bacteria only releases endotoxin when you provide it with food, because the food allows the bacteria to increase its turnover. and the dead bacteria that is no longer part of the colony, it ruptures, and the endotoxin is part of its outer wall of the so-called gram-negative bacteria. So basically, you only get in that if you're feeding the bacteria. If the food is digested by the time, like whatever remains in terms of waste products, by the time they reach the colon, if most of it is already processed, then you're not going to be getting a very high endotoxin response. So you can achieve the same benefits by watching what you eat. Now, some proponents of fasting will say, "Well, what about all the studies that show that drastically increased lifespan of animals that are fasted?" Again, exact same benefits and even better benefits have been demonstrated in non-fasted animals by restricting certain components in the food, such as the amino acids L-tryptophan, precursor to serotonin, cysteine, or methionine. Either one of the three, or actually all three together, the restricting all three together had the highest benefit, increased the maximal lifespan the most than any other intervention known so far, and really blew the fasting out of the water. So the fasting really, which demonstrates that it's fasting is actually prevents you from ingesting certain components of the food that are detrimental to your health. Is that the best way of doing it? I wouldn't say so. How about not torturing yourself for fasting, but watching what you eat and reducing the intake of those amino acids? Where are those amino acids mostly present? Well, cysteine and tryptophan are mostly present in muscle meats. Methionine is present universally in very high amounts in grains, but especially the resistant starch. It's really high in methionine, especially legumes such as soy, beans, right? Less so for lentils, especially if it's well cooked. But soy and beans, really not very high in my book. So you can achieve the exact same benefits by knowing what the mechanism through which fasting improves health is, and engaging that mechanism through different measures that don't lead to the stress. Again, it's not. I mean, I remember there was a study in the in time, not study, but there was an article in Time magazine, which was around 2006 when the whole thing about fasting and extending lifespan first became popular. They had pictures of these two monkeys, basically like a monkey that was fasted for the latter half of its life, and another one that wasn't. And even though, like towards the end of their lives, like the one that died earlier was actually looking much more attractive and like a normal animal than the fasted one. The fasted one looked like a skeleton, refused to leave its cage even when it was given access to its favorite food, and additional access to new females. Like for males, that's like in nature, that's like a great sign of vitality, whether they're willing to engage in reproduction. So the fasted animal was barely alive. It was hibernating. Yeah, it lived 15% longer. But do you want to live like a zombie, like the latter half of your life, if you're going to be like not interested in having anything out of these good things that life has to offer? I wouldn't. I think most people would choose to maybe go a little earlier, but like feel like a normal human being. And now the good news is you can get the best of both worlds without torturing yourself by be careful about the presence of these anti-metabolic, lifespan shortening components of food, which are some of the amino acids, like I said, cysteine, tryptophan, and methionine are particularly bad. And if you cannot avoid them, you can balance their effects by eating anti-inflammatory amino acids, namely glycine, proline, hydroxyproline, taurine, beta-alanine. So most of these can be found in gelatin. So you can, if you really have to eat muscle meats because there's nothing else available, you really love it, and you don't want to give it up, it gives you tremendous pleasure in life, which is important, because it stimulates your brain activity, higher cognitive function. Then just eat a spoon of gelatin with each steak you, you devour. I mean, it's doesn't sound that bad, does it? I mean, like it doesn't really force you to change your dietary habits much. But again, if you can replace some of that food with, let's say, dairy, or like even things like white rice, I mean, it's probably going to be better because meats are very high in phosphorus, in phosphates, and it's the calcium to phosphate ratio that actually determines the metabolic rate. When the phosphate rises to a point in the body, to too much in the body, your metabolic rate starts declining no matter what you're eating. One benefit of the simple sugars such as sucrose, glucose, fructose, trehalose, maltose is that they actually bind and remove phosphates from the body. So you're artificially increasing the calcium to phosphorus ratio simply by eating those simple carbs. One way to increase your metabolic without changing anything else. So here's one for argument why people should be consuming, should not be restricting carbs, not necessarily adding more, right? Then then basically, so if you want, so again, like the fasting, so what about the yeah, autophagy, right? uh Not many people, well, I don't know if how many people know, but if you go and read the official version of autophagy, is that it is a stress response. So it's known to actually be extremely detrimental in specific situations, especially in sick, compromised organisms. Now, if you go to a hospital and you see a person who's been lying in their hospital bed for a month, no sane doctor will recommend fasting. It's just not going to do any good. Probably will hasten the demise of that patient. So autophagy has its role, but keep in mind that its evolutionary role was driven by stress, primarily starvation, to actually dispose of not only damaged mechanisms or damaged components of the cell, but also ones that are considered unnecessary. And guess what? When you're under stress, under chronic stress, eventually the body starts to dismantle this very expensive to maintain machinery known as the mitochondrial structure, which is responsible for the oxidative phosphorylation, and leaves only the very basic components such as glycolysis, which is a hallmark of the cancer cell. And by the way, fasting has been tried multiple times in cancer patients, invariably without an exception. And it's been tried since the 1950s without an exception. There is a benefit for the first few weeks, which can be explained by the reduction of endotoxin, giving your digestive system a break. And after that, after you trigger the stress metabolism, which is okay, there's no food, I'm going to switch to burning fat, right? I'm going to start to dismantle mitochondrial metabolism. I'm going to raise the stress hormones. So all of these are basically different ways to trigger the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. And it's been shown that the cancer patients who are fasted, after about 2 weeks, not only the tumor stops regressing, but then it starts growing again and becomes very aggressive and resistant to chemotherapy. So it's like, again, I think we've all experienced this with our paleo experiments. There was an initial benefit, which can be explained through various mechanisms, such as reduced inflammation, giving your digestive system a break, etc., etc. And then eventually you hit a wall. Well, with autophagy, you can actually make things worse. Because it's not a mechanism that preferentially removes dead or diseased tissue. It can actually remove healthy tissue if it's considered that the stress slash starvation is so severe that the body has to start disposing of mechanisms that are considered energetically expensive. And that's really the signal. When you restrict the energetic supply, eventually the body, being a self-adaptive mechanism, will start to dispose of things that you really do need in order to be fully human and alive. I mean, again, you want to be like that zombie macaque monkey that lived 15% longer but didn't even look like a monkey? Okay, fast yourself chronically. It's not going to produce long-term benefit if you're only fasting. It's better to assess what is it in the fasting that's producing the benefit and try to replicate that without the stress response. So the autophagy, speaking of which, so they're saying like, oh, if you never fast, you'll never give autophagy an opportunity to do its good part. Even assuming autophagy is 100% beneficial, I can send you a number of studies showing that actually sucrose, glucose, fructose, and the fungi sugar trehalose drastically upregulate autophagy, mostly by reducing inflammation. So actually, when inflammation is high, autophagy is kind of upregulated, but it cannot do its job very efficiently. So exercise, now they're saying that one of the reasons exercise is beneficial is because it triggers an inflammatory response because of tissue breakdown and the liberation of poopa from the tissues. And then when you stop exercising, this inflammatory response has damaged some tissues, has activated autophagy, and autophagy goes in, removes the dead tissue and also the other tissue that you wanted autophagy to remove to start with. But why cause more damage to get rid of the original damage that you wanted to get rid of? What if there's a simpler way without the stress? Turns out that many of these foods that the fasting community claims that are actually anti-autophagy directly promote autophagy itself. Simply type, yeah, there we go. You immediately found it. That's one of them. Then if you want, you can type in Google trehalose autophagy. Another study will come up. So it's not as simple as basically like, oh, if you're eating sugar, you're shutting off the autophagy and you'll accumulate disease damaged components and eventually you start leaking and disintegrating. It doesn't work that way. In fact, autophagy is a mechanism that's triggered by stress. And I guess if it's the right amount of stress, then some people call this hormesis, right? So it's known that hormesis has beneficial effects, but it's very difficult to maintain the right balance. You never know when you're going to be in a compromised state. Let's say like you're practicing fasting, right? That's constant. You're constantly restricting the number of calories, but your routine from a day-to-day basis and your exposures to stress is not. So what may have been a beneficial autophagy on Monday, I'm sorry, on, let's say, on Friday, when people tend to have lower stress, at least in the city, working like white collar like jobs, right? On Monday could basically send you to the hospital, like just because autophagy is now attacking vital components simply because you're under additional stress, which means there's even less energy available, right, to maintain the organism because you have to respond to the external stress. And now the autophagy triggered by fasting is turning against you. So again, you can actually trigger autophagy, all the autophagy that you need, by eating foods that do not mess with inflammation, that do not promote it. And in that case, autophagy is a very tightly regulated response, and you can promote it with by eating ripe fruit, because again, sucrose, fructose, maltose, trehalose, all of these fruits, eating well cooked mushrooms, you can actually do that without killing yourself with exercise or fasting. Try it out. I mean, there are biomarkers that are, I don't have them off the top of my head right now, but if you go to like Google and type biomarker for autophagy, you'll see some of them, and some of them actually available as tests. You can get a blood test for like the rate of autophagy in the body. And actually, if I remember reading correctly, one of them was actually if it goes too high, it's actually a biomarker of developing cancer. And even the Wikipedia page of autophagy speaks to that fact and says that very high rates of autophagy are seen in people with cancer because the cancer rates have such a high turnover rate. So many of them die so quickly that the autophagy has to be in overdrive to constantly be cleaning that up, right? But in the process, it's also destroying healthy tissue as well. So it doesn't sound like a process you want to be over upregulating. Let me just turn on the light.
Yeah. Okay. Let's unpack some of those things. So I think one of the biggest things to consider is there are certainly going to be short-term benefits to fasting and
Yes,
these type of things, because you are ultimately removing foods that can cause issues in your digestive system and
exactly.
our guts. This is now very much well known that our microbiome and our guts are a huge indicator of our health. There's direct connection with so many processes that happen in our body. And so not like giving your body those trigger foods that are causing issues is of course going to make you feel good, but at what cost? So over
Exactly.
time, this process can increase cortisol. And I really like reflecting on our journey and reflecting on like others who the same thing has happened to. I really think that everyone has their own cortisol threshold. So everyone comes into a fasting um, like regime and has a cortisol threshold, and it depends on at what stage they enter it, with how long it may take for them to potentially reach a wall. Some people may not, because they're able to reduce their cortisol levels in so many other ways, and they live a pretty like they're able to live a chill life. I am not like I choose to have a lot going on, and so my cortisol, like Sarah and I definitely reached a wall within like 2.5 3 years. And so I think that's always important to keep in mind is, yes, you're going to see noticeable benefits. One, you're not giving yourself that trigger food. And then two, you're likely also calorically restricting yourself. And so you may see temporary like weight gain. However, that may be, you may regain that quicker down the line. So I think that's always important to consider long-term versus short-term. What are the long-term repercussions and consequences? In terms of your comments on like the inflammatory amino acids, I'm always hesitant to talk negatively about protein, because I think if one looks at like the average American, they struggle to get protein in. And I
Yes,
think
that's true.
animal
Yeah.
protein is the most important and most bioavailable. I think context is always key. I don't think we should ever demonize red meat. Just, hey, realize that we talked about this last time, an entire animal is 50% gelatin.
Yeah.
So try to balance out your muscle meat with a gelatin
That's
source.
what I said. A spoon of gelatin doesn't change that much in your dietary habits. You can eat your steak every day, or like
Right.
with each meal, but eat a spoon of gelatin just to compensate for those inflammatory amino acids. Or if you're eating the tougher steak, like known as skirt steak, it has enough gelatin in itself, so you don't need to even add anything. So it's just avoid the finer meats that are kind of like, I don't know if you know, but like filet mignon about 100 years ago was considered food for poor people and for dogs because it was not considered good quality. It was the T-bone, like the skirt steak, things like that were actually much more highly priced and valued because people back then kind of knew through like folk tradition, I guess, and observation before medicine got involved and got corrupted the whole thing. They knew that the whole animal was really is much more valuable than these selective chunks of meat that are so tender and easy to digest, but they actually tend to be the least beneficial for you.
Yeah, just make sure that you're balancing out that methionine with the glycine source. So
exactly.
my favorite way to do this is to have gummies, like homemade gummies with gelatin powder or broth with pretty much, I try to have it every time I have a steak. And it's really not that hard to implement, and it's like fun I love broth. There's so many other benefits to it as well. So I personally think people should not avoid muscle meat because it's also really high in so many B vitamins.
Right.
Just don't eat muscle meat alone. This returns back to one of the things that you brought up earlier is protein is not an energy source. Carbs and fats are energies. If you just eat protein, your body's going to go on gluconeogenesis overdrive, and there are repercussions and consequences to that because your body needs glucose and it will make it out of the protein. So I think that
definitely don't go into protein deficiency. That by itself can trigger a very nasty chronic inflammatory response, and chronic protein deficiency leads over time to wasting of the really the important tissues in your body, not just the muscle mass, but also connective tissue, your thymus gland, and so on. So basically, do not cut down on the protein. All I meant to say is like I love red meat myself. All I was saying is that balance it so that you're balancing the inflammatory amino acids, and actually the only reason I brought this up is to emphasize that you can achieve the extension of the lifespan by not restricting your calories, but by being careful what you eat or what you balance it with, so that the inflammatory effect is subdued.
Yes, this is a great question to pose to someone who is very tied to fasting. Is there a way to achieve the same benefits that you get from fasting without the negative consequences? And the Ray Peat ideology believes, yes, there is. It's let's not interrupt our guts, and let's make sure that we take care of our protein intake, consume the right types of foods that are supporting our metabolism, supporting our biology, while not having to restrict ourselves, because our body is not going to thrive on thin air.
True.
Our body is going to thrive when it is given nutrients that it needs.
Exactly.
And so I will choose the thriving versus the I'm going to fast because I have poor food choices. So work on your food choices.
Yep.
Okay. Brought up a lot of great points there, but I do want to bring, you sent me some really interesting studies, and I think that it's interesting to show these. I've never seen these. Georgi has a blog here, right?
That's one of the studies that's really kind of ruffled the feathers. I got so many emails about it. I said, just if you want to criticize somebody, go. You can the author's contact information is in the actual study. I mean, you can show it does not. And actually, this one there's a link in there about the intermittent fasting, where if you click on that, there is a quote from the guy who did the study. Said, "I just because you're losing weight does not mean you're getting healthier."
Yeah. So basically what they found was that there was an increase in visceral fat. Is that right?
Yeah. So there was a slight decrease initially, and then eventually the visceral fats became resistant. That's what they call, look in the red. Visceral fat became resistant to this release of fatty acids during fasting. There were also signs that visceral fat and subcutaneous fat increased the ability to store energy as fat, likely to rapidly rebuild the fat store before the next fasting period. So in fact, the more you fast, if you're doing intermittent fasting, with every successive bout of fasting, you're kind of making your fatty tissue hungrier and more effective at storing more energy as more fat. If you then the very next time you start eating, even if you keep the caloric intake the same, so you're going to start converting more and more of those calories into fat, because that fat, your fat tissue is becoming, I guess, stressed, and kind of a signal that it's really things are getting harder and harder. So don't shred yourself. We're going to need you, and in fact, start building yourself even more.
And I think it's important to point out, this is a new study, guys. September 28th of last year. And so definitely go check this out. And then you had another one here. Um, so this is a very new study, I believe. Let me go to it. So this was
From March 2021.
March of this year.
Yeah.
And so Georgi include on his blog here, he includes some of the highlights of what they found. Oh, is this the same one?
So yeah, so the one this is about the fasting, and then there's one about intermittent fasting, which is linked. If you scroll up in the blog post,
Okay. This one?
At the very top, the second sentence, click on that, and that's actually about intermittent fasting. So the first one is about full fasting. This one is about intermittent fasting.
Okay.
And basically, this one didn't say that you're going to start gaining more weight, but it said you're going to start losing muscle mass, which is really crucial. And in fact, so basically, the intermittent fasting group lost muscle mass in key areas, and as a result, the ratio of their lean mass to fat mass decreased, which means they actually lost more muscle mass than fat, which is really bad, which is something that Ray keeps emphasizing. And I've seen many studies on it. I myself experienced it when I was trying to do the chronic fasting. Basically, like you're gonna, yes, you lose some fat, but actually the more you fast, the more the loss starts turning towards muscle, simply because your body wants that sugar and the brain wants the sugar, so the gluconeogenesis will kick in. So if you're going to be doing fasting, intermittent fasting is probably the least dangerous thing, but it still had negative repercussions such as decline in muscle mass and basically really disrupting sleep. And now there are many studies linking the quality of your sleep and the duration of your sleep to the development of multiple chronic degenerative conditions, especially cancer and Alzheimer's disease. Night shift people are known to have like the 10 to 15 times higher risk for any of the cancers you can come up with. In addition to diabetes and cardiovascular disease, many of them are overweight despite not overeating. It's one of the, it's like, now they're starting to basically evaluate what's in the environment of these night shift people that's causing this issue. I mean, it's dark, right? And many of them are under fluorescent lights, which are abundant in blue light. The blue light suppresses the mitochondrial function, so it lowers your metabolic rate. So not only you don't sleep, but you're constantly exposed to a stressful environmental condition. So basically that's really what happens. If you're intermittently fasting, you will basically lose muscle mass. You will destroy your sleep, which on its own will have other detrimental effects down the road. And if you're chronically fast, you're going to turn your fatty tissue into a very hungry and metabolically resistant tissue to deal with, and it's going to become more and more active and store more and more of subsequent meals as more fat. Another reason not to chronically fast.
Yeah, I think it's always important to consider the long term. If someone experiences like benefits from short-term intermittent fasting, I don't think that that's going to have as big of repercussions as like excessive fasting. I know that there are like a lot of people who are doing like 48-hour fasts like all the time, and I think that these studies kind of show that, hey, there's some long-term repercussions and consequences of some of these.
Yeah, in animals, in nature, wild animals, like they do undergo through periods of fasting, usually when they're sick, but they never go for more than a few days because the animal knows that if it cannot find a food supply, it's done in, whether it recovers from the disease or not. So basically, it's known that sick animals will refuse eating, but it almost never goes for longer than, let's say, 2 or 3 days, depending on the species. Now, and they don't do it periodically. They don't say, oh, let me give my digestive system a break. So every Friday, I'm going to stop eating until Monday, and then I'll resume. No, they only do it when they feel there's something wrong with their digestive system. Usually they've ingested something toxic, poisonous, etc. Right? So they one day give their digestive system a break, but it cannot be too long of a break, because after that, the whole stress system kicks in, and you little by little you lose these inhibitory mechanisms on growth. And when you lose them completely, we very literally revert back to a more primitive form of organism, which is basically just a random collection of disorganized cells, which is known as cancer. Now they're starting to redefine cancer as actually a life system that has reverted back to its evolutionary past 2 to 3 billion years ago, similar to an amoeba or like a colony of yeast or like a colony of bacteria. Basically, it can only produce energy by this very primitive system called glycolysis, and it cannot translate and transition into the producing the more higher and energetically efficient output from glucose, preferably, which on which you depend for, which requires mitochondria. And cancer cells, like or actually even normal cells, if you fast them for too long, they start to dismantle their mitochondria, which is never a good sign. And it's now becoming more widely known. And I think that's why doctors are now kind of like cautioning people, saying like, if you want to fast, come on, come here and see me. Let's do some tests first. Let's see how you are. Maybe there's a different reason why you're gaining this weight, right? Now, like the full-on fasts are recommended to be done only under the supervision of a doctor. Intermittent fasting, you can do it. I don't think like a day will kill you, if you don't eat, or if you don't eat, like let's say, what is it, 16-8? You fast for 16 hours and you eat for 8. I think that will be okay. I still wouldn't do it every day, simply because over time, that stress of the 16 hours of not eating, especially if you have a stressful job, that amplifies it, and you're kind of losing the benefits. You can actually end up being in a chronically fasted state by doing intermittent fasting if your lifestyle is so stressful that it activates the stress system, the HPA axis, right? Even more so. So keep in mind, when you're not fasted, you shouldn't be stressed. I'm sorry, when you're fasted, you should not be stressed. If you're fasting and stress arrives, you have immediately erased almost all of the benefits that the fasting gave you. So you want to be fasting, do it when you're on vacation or you have enough spare time to not be bothered by annoying people around you, the soul suckers that are all over, and just do it wisely. And the moment you start feeling like this interfering with your sleep, with your desire to live life, so-called anhedonia, very common symptom of depression, but also very common symptom of chronic disease in general. The moment you start feeling like, oh, life is all the same, it's all the same routine, it's just drudgery, right? Nothing really changes, nothing is interesting, then it means you've overstressed yourself too much. It's not just depression. Depression is a symptom of chronic stress, and potentially you can do it by severely restricting your dietary choices or regimen.
Yeah. Again, context is key. If you are someone that is a very stressed individual, I was that person, you should not be fasting.
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
the direct consequence of it is a rise in cortisol.
Yes,
Um,
only do fasting if you're not in a stress position, and if you only do it to the point where it doesn't trigger the stress response. Then I think there is a fair argument to be made that you will reap some benefits. But the way it's done in the blogosphere and the way some gurus are promoting it is like the cure all for everything. There's no evidence for that. Show me one study that showed fasting cured diabetes. Show me one study that showed and actually kept the weight after cured it, because it's very easy to lose weight while you fast if you're really chronically like restricted, caloric restricted. But what happens after you're not? Are you telling me that if you from 2,000 calories you went to 1,000 calorie regimen, let's say for 3 months, you lost all the excess weight, everything is great, and then you're saying like, okay, let me go back to normal? Well, the response usually from the doctors is, no, this is your new normal. You have to stay on 1,000 calories. I don't think most people will interpret this as success.
yeah. Again, think long term, improve metabolic health, improve your endocrine system. Okay, can we do one more criticism, and then I'm gonna have to get you on again, because we're not even, we've still got a lot more criticisms to get through, but I think that this next one relates to what we were just talking about, because this is a huge thing that people say. Sugar and gut dysbiosis. So
Right.
Vita eats sugar. Sugar feeds bad bacteria and yeast overgrowth in people's guts. And I mean, I've heard a lot of people who say I reduce my sugar and I noticeably feel better. So what are your thoughts there?
So a couple of things. First, if you have a fungal infection such as candida, do not starve the candida, or it can actually become invasive and it will kill you in less than a week. Simply go to Google and type invasive candidiasis, and you'll see what comes up. Actually, go to the Wikipedia page of candida, and it will tell you that once it becomes invasive, it has about a 40% mortality rate, and it's almost impossible to treat. There aren't that many. Once it gets to your bloodstream, we really, as a species, we do not have many defense mechanisms against fungi. Um, don't know if you remember back in maybe 2013, 14, there was a pharmacy out in Boston that got busted for basically providing these cortisol injections that doctors were giving to to people for back pain. They were injecting their spines with basically this cortisol solution, right? Because it's anti-inflammatory and it's known to relieve back pain. Of course, it's not treating the cause, but it's a very common thing for chronic back pain. And then it turned out that these vials were contaminated with some kind of a fungi, and I think 14 or 15 people died. Every single one that got diagnosed with a fungal infection, all of them died in the hospital. None of them could be saved. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that candidiasis, even though many people have it in their digestive system, when it's actually receiving a supply of carbs, and if it's the simple carbs, not the resistant ones, it will actually stay in your digestive system. If you starve it of carbs, it starts to produce these filaments that bury deeper and deeper into your intestines. And if they puncture the intestine and end up in the bloodstream, then you're really in a world of hurt, and it's not many things that can be done. So a very important reason not to starve your candida. Now, so another thing that you should also be doing is that not supply it with the resistant starch, because that has been shown to trigger an inflammatory response in the intestine, and nitric oxide and a bunch of other inflammatory mediators are actually triggering even more candidal overgrowth. So there is some truth to the carbs making candida grow, but it tends to be the resistant starches that are making it grow. And even if it grows, as long as it stays in your intestine, it is a manageable problem. It's not going to kill you. Once it becomes systemic, very, very serious issue. So, what about bacteria? Well, ideally, your small intestine should not have any bacteria in it. And like I said, if you're eating the proper foods, which are easily digestible, the vast majority of whatever you're eating will get metabolized and absorbed in the stomach and in the upper portion, upper third of the small intestine. So by the time it reaches even like the lower half of the small intestine, if you're a healthy person, then most of that food should be digested and not really provide much food for the bacteria. Now, if you're eating the resistant starch, that's a whole different issue. Now, these people that say, oh, carbs feed the bacteria, you should be restricting carbs. By the same token, why are you promoting the resistant carbs? Those are the ones precisely that make it to the colon and feed the bacteria there.
So what are resistant, like what are sources of resistant starches?
Beans, let's say, like basically like they're long chain oligosaccharides that are found in undercooked starchy foods, such as potatoes are fine. They don't have that much. They don't have too much of that. White rice is fine also, but beans, especially undercooked, terrible. Lentils, same thing. Soy, undercooked, same thing. So anything that gives you a lot of gas is usually an indication that it has reached a sufficient amount of undigested food, has reached a bacterial colony, which may have formed a biofilm. It's attached to the intestine. It's reached a portion of the intestine which has a bacterial overgrowth, and basically the bacteria now is starting to multiply. The turnover has increased, and basically gas and endotoxin almost always go together. That's really what's happening. There's food that's being digested by the bacteria instead of being digested by the intestine and the stomach and absorbed before it reaches the bacterial colony in undigested form. So actually, the simple carbs, the easily digestible ones, are much less likely to give you that issue with the bacterial overgrowth, because they should be digested long before they reach a portion of the intestine that has bacteria. Now, in hypothyroid people, or people under chronic stress, which tends to be the same thing because eventually stress lowers your thyroid function, because these people underproduce sufficient amounts of gastric acid. Gastric acid is required in order to keep the small intestine, or at least the upper portion of it, sterilized, bacteria free. Ideally, your entire small intestine should be bacteria free, but recent studies have demonstrated a significant portion of the population is starting to exhibit the so-called condition SIBO, small intestine bacterial overgrowth. And that's not a good thing, because it leaves less and less, like a smaller and smaller portion of your digestive tract uncolonized by bacteria. And which means that even if you're eating the simple, easily digestible foods, sufficient amount of them will actually end up reaching the bacteria and will cause problems. What can you do to get rid of SIBO? And why is it there? Why is it there to start with? Well, chronic stress is one thing, but another thing which many people don't realize is that I think like a third of adults over 40 years are taking an acid blocker, so-called they either proton pump inhibitors, or the older ones, the histamine H2 antagonists. And basically, you go to a doctor, say, oh, doctor, I got indigestion, like burping, burning here in the sternum. So the doctor will be like, okay, could be two things, either GERD, gastrointestinal reflux disease or a heart disease. So let me exclude the heart disease, right? And they'll do some checks, quick checks on you. And then if you have GERD, they'll give you an acid blocker because they think that the condition, which is the irritation and inflammation of the esophagus, is driven by basically food and digestive juices and acid basically going back up the sphincter. The esophageal sphincter is loosened and is opening up and is allowing food to go back up your esophagus. And after food is being inside the stomach, it gets mixed with food, with acid and other digestive enzymes. So when it goes back up, it can really irritate like the mucosa of your esophagus. However, it's been shown that these acid blocker drugs, while they stop the symptoms, they actually over time they do not treat the condition, right? As soon as you stop the drugs, it actually returns with vengeance, because then you start overproducing the gastric acid, because the body feels like, you've been so chronically deprived, and it has a very important role keeping bacteria under control, keeping the small intestine clean. So anyway, so a significant portion of the adults is taking these anti-acid drugs and is basically giving them a SIBO condition, because any food you digest is bound to have some bacteria in it. No matter how well cooked, no matter how well processed, there will be some organisms in it that are still alive. And when you ingest it, and if there is not enough or even at all any gastric acid produced, this means that this food will actually reach, the bacteria in that food will reach your small intestine, and over time will actually start to colonize it, which is not a good thing, because like I said, it leaves less and less of your digestive tract, uncolonized by bacteria. We already know having too much bacteria, microbiome overgrowth, even in the colon, is already problematic. We already know that having it in the small intestine is actually a very bad thing, now called known as SIBO, right? SIBO, small intestine bacterial overgrowth. And if the only thing that is non-colonized by bacteria is your stomach, and eventually you completely kill off the acid production, you may even end up having bacteria even in your stomach. In fact, some people have so much bacterial overgrowth that they actually, when they eat carbs, the bacteria and the yeast that has grown into their digestive tract starts synthesizing alcohol, ethanol. So they get the so-called drunken syndrome after eating carbs. You can get legally drunk if you're to the point where the bacteria and the yeast have colonized such a large portion of your digestive tract. You can get pulled over by a cop and given the breathalyzer test, and then they'll say, you're drunk, don't stop lying, tell me how many drinks you had, and your response is 2 slices of bread. They'll probably, well, I don't know if they'll laugh, but they'll certainly arrest you, may even charge you with like purposeful lying to a law enforcement officer. But it's no laughing matter. You can actually get legally drunk if you are if you decrease the acid production to the point where your digestive tract is now over colonized by all of these organisms that ferment the carbs and turn them into alcohol. So make sure acid production is a good level. Avoid those anti-acid drugs. They've been shown to not cure the condition, and now new studies have demonstrated that GERD is actually an inflammatory condition, which again implicates PUFA. And as a remedy, gelatin, a large component of, glycine, a large component of gelatin, has been shown to actually cure the inflammatory underpinnings of GERD, and it can actually resolve your acid issues without any of the toxic side effects of those drugs. So another thing that can increase the production of gastric acid is carbon dioxide. So that another reason why hypothyroid people don't produce enough gastric acid is because its production depends on the amount of carbon dioxide synthesized. Yet another great example of why carbon dioxide is not a waste byproduct of metabolism. It is vital for your systemic health. So low metabolism means low CO2 production, right? Which means low gastric acid, poor digestion, and on it goes. And this actually starts, it forms a positive feedback cycle, because, if you can't digest properly food, your metabolic rate will decline even more. And you're going to put on more pounds, right? Which will trigger even more overgrowth, and so on and so on. So stay away from those drugs. Make sure you raise your carbon dioxide level as much as you can. And again, which brings us back to carbs. The best way to raise your carbon dioxide production is by consuming carbs that are easily metabolized. Things such as the sucrose, the ripe fruits, like the honey, right? Avoiding resistant starch. And if you have to eat starch, eat well-cooked thin starches like potatoes and rice. And potatoes have an additional benefit because they're very high in keto acids, which in the body get converted to protein. So in fact, if you want to have, there's an old Russian study which demonstrated that you can survive and actually thrive on a diet that consists exclusively of nothing but potatoes, butter, and salt. So this a full it's a complete diet, doesn't cause any deficiencies. Like, it may get boring after a while, but it's perfectly healthy. Why? Because even though if you look at the packaged information, if you're buying potatoes that have a label, you will say like they have a very low amount of protein. That's in regards to preformed protein, but they're very high on keto acids, which in the body bind with ammonia, which we're overproducing, by the way, on a regular basis, and it's a toxic thing. And in fact, you'll be getting excellent protein by combining a waste product of your metabolism, right? And getting all the benefits of protein without any of the side effects, because the keto acids not only will not generate ammonia like regular protein, they will actually lower it.
Hey, Georgie, I have to run. My
Okay.
dogs just escaped.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. Can we resume this call?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I will send you an email. I am so sorry. I've got to go like right now.
I completely understand. No problem.
We'll pick up right where this ended. I'll send you an email. Thank you.
Okay, excellent.
I'm so sorry. Bye
Good
bye.
luck.